and welcome to Queering the Ballot II. I'm Linda Pepper, and this is a podcast hosted by Einand, Nigolak, and Galplus. Today, we will be exploring shaping narratives and looking at LGBT plus Kenyans' portrayal in the democratic process. I'm joined by two lovely guests, and I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves. Please tell us who you are, more about the work you do, and one thing you're looking forward to.
Hi, everyone. I am Ngare Kariuki. I am a communication specialist focusing on gender justice in Africa. I like to think I am a shaper of narratives, especially considering the stories that we see out there. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to is how we can contribute to shaping those particular narratives about gender, especially when it comes to the participation and representation and inclusion of queer folks in the Kenya political space.
My name is Zaha Indimuli. I wear many hats. I work in the media space. I run a show called The Last Word on NTV. And on the other times, I am studying to be a neuroscientist. So I'm a medical student at current. In other fields, I am a feminist. I work as a consultant in different faculties. And of course, I work with the queer space as well, just to ensure that everybody gets it right at one way or another. Yeah.
Zaha, what's one thing you're looking forward to?
In this conversation or in my entire life? I think it depends.
In your entire life?
I look forward to a space where we can have narratives that actually speak for us, with us, and by us. I think it's very, very key that we decolonize the conversations too, and that our narratives are owned by us. I think I'm very interested to see what that looks like in the moment, but also to see how these narratives grow and shape and change, and just showcasing the complexities of what humanity is, which is that we're different and diverse. And I would just love to see that in communications and in narratives moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Both of you have already gotten us started in this conversation. I would actually like to ask you, so far, how have you seen LGBT plus people represented on TV, radio, and in print?
I think you're talking about traditional media, what we like to call traditional or legacy media. And the story there is quite telling, because I would describe the representation as a swing from complete erasure. And by erasure, I don't mean invisibility. I mean active erasure, where there is an active suppression of any mention or any inclusion of LGBTQ folks and their perspectives, their opinions, not even their identities, but actually their opinions, their expertise in media spaces. But the other extreme of erasure is now the sensationalism, where maybe a story is triggered by a news item, and there is an overemphasis on objectifying the queer folks and making them the subject of the story rather than a person who is participating in a particular conversation. And so that has been very consistent. I think it is systematic. I think it is by design, and it comes from top down, from the ownership of the media houses, where there is clear instructions. Do not give platforms, do not highlight, do not maybe paint positively. And if you're going to discuss it, the topic, bring someone who is against the community already. So that's what I have seen. It prevails, it cuts across TV, radio, and print. Radio is particularly toxic because of especially the indigenous languages and the slurs that happen in there. And when politicians come on the platform, just the language that goes in there. So I have nothing positive to say, especially about traditional media when it comes to representation of LGBTQ folks.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Zaha?
I think it's almost non-existent, and I would love to also agree with Ngare. Like, it's very much a pendulum. It's almost like inexistent. But I think I would love to dive in the fact that the idea of just queer experiences in mainstream media is almost a very looked down upon situation. I think if you are a queer person in media spaces, often they're not surviving there is almost technically everything about you being queer being the basic problem. And then you might find, so when you're trying to articulate issues that cut across queer people, but also everyone else in the society, because I mean, we're all Kenyans at the end of the day, you find that you're told, tone that down, or rather, we're not open to that conversation. And it's like, what are you not often about? Humanity, really? Are you against human rights? And I think these conversations don't happen in media too, because categorically we're looking at how are these narratives also affecting people's capital? And I think we have to have a very serious conversation around how do people see queer narratives or other queer experiences being factioned within our spaces. Sometimes you find when you think through queer experiences and queer narratives and you want to have them in a media space, they're looking, our donors will back out. They're looking, we won't get the credibility from the public. But then at what point did we get to having a whole experience of our people cut across to something being against development or something being against capital investment? So I think it's almost null and void in media spaces. And I think for most of us who are in those newsrooms, the immediate mention of that discussion is almost an immediate cutoff. I think there's also a lot of epistemic violence happening, whereby the ownership of the narratives is also not necessarily by queer folks. There's usually a third party mention most of the time, whereby queer stories can only get there when someone actually speaks for them. And so it begs the question, like, I know we have queer folks around. I know queer people exist. So why wasn't a queer person, or rather, why weren't queer folks involved in their own narrative and articulating their own stories? But also then we shy away again from highlighting their stories and then perpetuate this type of epistemic violence. Eventually, by the time we're starting to think about, do queer people exist, when you have no representation whatsoever, it almost becomes like, we're non-existent and completely erases, like the way Ngare was saying, completely erases our people, which is insane. And then the slurs and the vulgar. We need to be so honest about how we are just used as rage bait. Generally, queer folks, when stories are coming up, and even as we're getting to the conversation, there are very many forms of media. And in very many forms of media where there's freedom to actually speak about queer experiences, it's like a rage bait. It's almost like the conversation of queer folks has to come up to bring some sort of emotion. And all of a sudden, this moral complexity and God complexes that are happening within our societies. I used to make queer experiences look like this default evil thing, and therefore voting against it. And rather, one way or another, the narrative is used to caution the rest of the public, which also just increases the forms of violence that I see around. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You've both brought up a really important point around dehumanization and how we've been dehumanized. I would like to ask then, given the context that you've provided, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being like dangerous coverage that does more harm than good, and 5 being balanced coverage that includes LGBT plus and ally voices, where would you say the representation in Kenya falls? And why I ask this is because ACAS conducted a study where they did a baseline study of looking at media coverage of LGBT plus people across various countries over a number of years, and they came up with the scale of evaluating how fair and balanced the stories were. So given that, where do you think coverage in Kenya falls on a scale of 1 to 5? I'll start with you, Ngare.
And by coverage, we are still sticking, at least for now, to traditional media. And I want to say 2, but I'm so reluctant. I will stick with a high 1, if there's anything like that, like a 1 point something. And that's because I'm looking at it from a history where it was either totally non-existent or totally dangerous.
Yeah.
But that has shifted or is shifting. And it is not because, I will not even necessarily give credit to media and media owners. It's because of advocacy and the push, had to put people on the spot. I remember in my past life, I was a journalist, and one of the things we used to be told was that we are here to speak for the underdog. We are here to amplify the voices of the suppressed and the marginalized.
Yeah.
I think a favorite quote was, we are here to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. But it seems there was a line to that. Like, we are going to represent and speak up and amplify the voices of everyone apart from queer people. And when it comes to LGBTQ folks, then we want balance. Then we want, what about the other side? We get into a lot of whataboutism. So that pushing back and exposing of the hypocrisy of traditional media and the double standards of traditional media is what has pushed the 1, in my opinion, to a high 1. But I would say the default, the instinct, the comfort zone for the traditional media is still a very dangerous narrative. And that is shown by what triggers, if you look at what triggers stories in mainstream media. Very rarely will a story just come because, hey, here's someone who's LGBTQ, has a very good business idea, and they want to showcase it in either a weekend show, a morning show, not even in the mainstream, I mean, the prime news. You would rarely see those stories. But when there's like a court ruling, after fighting and advocacy and going to court to fight for rights, and then finally there's a ruling, that's when you start seeing those particular stories. But the stories don't come as a humanizing story where you're bringing in a queer folk to talk about their experiences and how they feel about this particular ruling. And even when they do that, they want to put them face to face with someone who is totally there and completely there to dehumanize them, not to discuss the ruling. So I am here fighting for my existence and my identity. You're there not even fighting for your own or justifying your own. You're already comfortable in your identity and your existence. It is not being questioned. You're there to judge that particular existence. It is never a fair debate. It is never a balanced conversation. And I think until that changes, it remains a dangerous conversation in mainstream media.
Thank you so much, Zaha.
Wow. I think that's actually a perfect answer, to be honest. I think for me, I'd give it a 0.5, really. Media can do way more. Media can... the trust and the civic responsibility given to media houses deserves that they have this conversation. So I'll give it a 0.5 because of negligence. I'll give it a 0.5 because of the sensationalism and the fact that the moment I see queer narratives or other queer stories being articulated is only when there's some hot news to be effectively put together. And they do not create the reporting guidelines, for example, do not necessarily bring these narratives to a humanitarian perspective. It's to sort of announce some sort of emotion out of people where it's almost constantly backlash. So the articulation of these narratives is also a very big problem. We need reporting guidelines that actually fundamentally recommend how best to humanize these stories. Again, this popular rhetoric of, just making queer people this very separate group of people that do not exist, that are very, very different and shouldn't be part of the public is also very much articulated within media spaces, whereby we not only dehumanize queer people, we make it look like, they're fallen from the moon. These are new alienating beings that we're trying to understand, and which are, to be very, very honest, automatically puts us in a very bad place. I also give it a 0.5 because, like Ngare was saying, it's never fair. It's never a fair conversation, whereby there's also no right for reply, there's no right for clarification. The stories that are being articulated at the same time are articulated by people who have no idea of the lived realities of these queer folks. And so for me, a 0.5 is actually way too much because I work there.
No, I think you both raise really important points, and you've started going into a conversation I wanted us to have about whether we have seen any evolution in the coverage that we're getting. But moving away from traditional media, I'd like us to focus on social media for a bit. And there's a point you raised, Zaha, about who controls the narrative. So I'd like to ask you, is the representation we're seeing on social media similar to what is occurring on mainstream media? And would you say that on social media, LGBT plus people own more of the narrative, control the narrative that is being shared there? Yeah, let's start there.
Social media offers an opportunity for the queer community to look at owning the narrative. But also, I think that can become a bit subjective, considering that most of these technocrats and most of these companies ideally are extremely homophobic, or ideally considerably continue to presume the hate. So social media has opened up a space where, I think Galk, even the people who we're here for, I see a lot of content happening. I see a lot of queer folks showing up. Something as simple as seeing a queer folk enjoying a day at a restaurant as a normal person is something that I'm tending to see now more. But the indifference also is the fact that also social media tends to expose to more risk. at the same time. Right now, we're having things like geolocation that people can get out of your post. We're also seeing the fact that there's also a wider array of responses. We're seeing a lot of cyberbullying. We're seeing a very big increase of technologically facilitated gender-based violence. So it's a matter of, again, we're in another pendulum where since structures do not exist to primarily keep queer people safe, as we continue to innovate spaces, they continue to primarily be unsafe because there's no standard for safety. And so when these conversations are happening, the algorithms are also being trained vis-a-vis the articulations that we're seeing locally and even internationally. I mean, with a couple of presidents around the world are homophobic and transphobic, and they're taking away rights and taking us back to the 1900s. Then automatically the algorithms tends to train its user measurements towards the same rhetoric. And so you find that if these particular individuals who, everybody now starts a podcast, but they have no problem, but I do have a problem actually. But everybody wants a mic. Everybody wants a camera on their face. And then the things that they spat out are absolute violent rhetoric. And that's what we're seeing around social media. And I think I'm very scared of the fact that if the algorithm is trained to be abusive, then it means historically it can also be trained to erase what it doesn't fit. So I think in an array of looking at what it means for us to occupy social media, and as much as I see a lot of improvement, I have a fear that we're going to see the same thing that has been happening in traditional media because there has not been any existing laws or policies that continue to push for people's safety.
Thank you so much. You're raising the fact that there's an opportunity for LGBT plus people to own the narrative on social media, but there's also a great risk there. Ngare?
Yeah, as we say, high risk, high returns. And I think what Zaha said about social media is quite accurate because on the one end, it is one of those spaces where we're seeing a lot of opportunities for the democratization of even information. It's one of those places where, for example, a queer person can have agency in terms of just appearing as themselves and choosing what they discuss, choosing what topic to have in that particular space, compared to traditional media, where the briefing that happens before and the disclaimers that happen before you even begin speaking are very different. But that is still set up against the system, which is now what you're calling the owners of social media platforms, the algorithms that they have designed. And especially now, where we're in the age of, authoritarian leadership all over the world, we're seeing what is happening with X and Facebook, where they're saying, okay, we are now going to remove all controls. When it's free for all, but it's not really free for all. It's again that lie of balance that is in the traditional media, where they know what brings clicks is hate. They know that the homophobia is what drives the numbers. And so by saying no, we want a fair sport, or we want a fair game, we want to remove controls, they're basically saying, okay, go in for the kill. And unfortunately, that's what is happening. So, but I still see social media, unlike any other space that we have seen before, because of the fact that it emerges from the bottom, like it doesn't come top down in a way that traditional media has, still has a lot of opportunities for that. And examples of this is, when I look at queer stories that are surfacing in social media, whether or not they're being suppressed, fought, facing backlash, they're stories of not just joy and resistance, but a joyful kind of resistance. Where in the past, and mostly even in traditional media and also the older social media, the queer stories that were there were stories of woye, leave us alone, like you're asking to exist, or you're begging, you're begging to be recognized. But now it's like, no, I have what I like to call full citizenship, in this space as all the rest of you. Of course, it comes at great personal cost. And those are the things that we need to still work on, and the guardrails and the safety measures that need to be worked on. But I still see it as an opportunity to drive this conversation. I think I began even in my introduction, about the hope that I had for not just this conversation, but for the entire space, looking at the digital activism that has been happening in Kenya, starting with the Gen Z protests a few years ago. This is an opportunity to capitalize that particular wave of young people and the opportunities in these particular social media platforms to bubble up a narrative that we've not seen before that I still think is impossible in traditional media.
That's true.
Yeah.
Still have a long way. Yeah.
Okay. I want to take up what you've said about the Gen Z protests and focus more closely on political discourse and the electoral process, right? So in 2024 and 2025, Outright conducted a study, and the results showed that in at least 51 countries, politicians had made homophobic or transphobic remarks in the lead up to elections. And that's a trend we see where LGBT plus people are used as scapegoats. Going back to what both of you said about politicians looking to stir moral panic, to this as a form of distraction, would you say that that's the same for Kenya? Is that also accurate for Kenya?
Oh my, immediately, yes. I think if you want to win an elections in Kenya, you have to find a way to bring that rhetoric. And it's so sad for me to say that, but it's literally, we're not only a scapegoat, we're literally the whole point of the vote for them. And it's unfortunate because, again, it brings a lot of violence, number one, to the queer community, but equally, I think we need to also reverse this. I think a politician who has nothing to say other than what happens in people's bedrooms, quote unquote, what happens in people's identities, what happens in people's expression, I don't see why you should get the seat. There's so many things for you to articulate when you're running for an election. You need to figure out the water crisis, you need to figure out garbage. In fact, there's so many things to do. So the fact that we actually don't take it seriously to push back on this political rhetoric that they used to also have us as a way of them to getting a vote might also be a very good opportunity for us to push back in these coming elections. I mean, you have way too many things to focus on. But also Kenya, absolutely. Kenyan politicians have found a very good loophole with how also we have a very religious state, to be very honest. So when you have a population of religious voters, one thing that can easily corner them into voting for you would definitely be something around quoting the Bible, something about putting up people into an expression of moral policing. And so I've seen it so many times. Last election, we saw the same, which first of all, they forget that as they continue to streamline such negative rhetorics, especially within the queer community, we also have the same over-sexualization happening within the same context. Like politics in Kenya have deliberately been made to be a hate crime against particular individuals for you to actually get a vote. So I see it a lot. I don't know about you, Ngare.
Yeah. In Kenya, I think for Kenya, when it comes to politics, and let me just do it chronologically, the last few elections, I would say we've been lucky during the actual election period. There were not trigger moments or flash points because normally those moments are triggered. But the Gen Z protests gave us a what we call a flash forward or whatever. Of what is going to happen in the elections next year because
foreshadowing.
The foreshadowing. Because you saw what happened when the government was reeling and they're trying to push back and they don't know how to hit back against the Gen Zs, and they quickly went to that narrative of like, okay, these people are being sponsored by foreigners.
Exactly, they're coming with the iPhones.
Yeah, and they're gay people here, they've brought their money and they're here to disrupt our country.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that in the context of what is happening right now in Kenya, where our president has decided to go down that road, of like just insults, with the opposition.
Yeah.
Like, unlike previous elections, at least the presidential ones, we never used to see those personal attacks. And I'm just seeing a situation where, even as I talked about joy in resistance and us celebrating like the flourishing of human dignity and agency and citizenship of queer people, opportunities, unfortunately, for them to be weaponized in the coming election. And I think for me, it's a worrying thing, but also sometimes, as I said, with great power comes great responsibility, with great influence also comes great backlash. And so that backlash is still kind of
necessary.
Pointing to something positive that is happening, that there is an agency coming here. Like, people are no longer begging to be recognized.
100%.
They're already just owning their identity, they're owning their existence, and owning their participation in all the democratic processes that are happening. So yes, it's coming, but for me, it's coming in a way that we're ready for it.
Yeah.
We're ready to engage in those narratives. We will not just be tools and weapons that politicians can wield to hit each other with, which is what is happening. But we're going to be part of that conversation as people with full agency in those conversations and having something to bring to the table.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You've actually answered a question I was going to ask around whether LGBT plus people are seen as political actors in their own right or subjects of debate. And I feel like based on what you're saying, it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
You know, where right now we're owning our agency, we're taking space and participating, but we've also previously been used as, our identities have been weaponized and used as a tool to stir panic and fear and to rally votes.
And it's a delicate dance because when you ask the question from the corner of how they are seen and treated, there's also the point of how they're viewing themselves. Because when you exist in a system that is hell-bent on dehumanizing you, your temptation is to shrink back and just be quiet and quietly pass by and exist. But now taking up that particular existence where you're like, I don't care how you see me, but I'm going to say and speak about how I'm going to be seen. I'm going to come forward as an expert in this particular thing, as a business person, as a taxpayer. You know, that's what the Gen Z protests were about. And the queer people who were on the streets, they were not protesting anything to do with queerness. They were protesting everything that makes them citizen and the same issues that all Kenyans are facing. And I think that's a dimension that is new in that particular conversation of whether queer folks are going to be depicted as just subjects of conversation or participants in that particular conversation.
Thank you so much. What you're saying alludes to something important that Masafu said in episode 1, which is that Kenya is our business and therefore we have to be involved. Zaha, I wanted to ask you about this, what we're discussing, how our identities are weaponized, how we're a subject of debate. What impact do you think it has on LGBT plus people's ability to engage and participate in political and electoral processes?
I think nowadays I see it in two fronts. There's a pushback whereby there's a lot of fear, of course. But also something interesting that I'm getting to see is that it propels more action and it propels more agency. Not that necessarily queer folks or queer experiences are trying to prove a point, but also because maybe you deserve to understand that governance is also a setback to why you're not getting your rights. And the fact that queer spaces and queer organizations and queer folks in general are starting to have a conversation about how governance influences them and their rights. And this might be also an opportunity to also make it as a marker as we head towards our elections. I mean, if I am not able to live freely in this country, you do not deserve my vote. And it might also be a very good opportunity to start looking at queer folks as a voting bloc in itself. What does it look like to organize and mobilize registration? What does it look like to actually ask people to show up and vote? What does it look like to also have our allies make it to parliament? Because again, we have this sensationalization happening within the presidential seat, ignoring the fact that we have 5 seats that are actually very crucial because the president cannot do anything if the parliament is sober. So what does it look like for queer spaces and in queer organizations and queer folks in general to look at their vote as something that matters too? And the agency that comes with that is that you take back the power that they so utterly abuse, and it creates a space for us to think through, why are you making it to parliament if you're homophobic, genuinely? Why are you making it to parliament if you're transphobic? Why are you making it to parliament if you have no idea of the people that make of the population of Kenya? And that can easily translate to the fact that you have not done your homework and you're not a credible leader, because if you're not sure of these particular groups of people, and we are not few, to be very honest, if you're not able to articulate the issues that matters to Kenyans in the first place, then you won't be able to articulate water. You won't be able to fix garbage. You won't be able to fix roads. I mean, you'll have the biggest scandal of corruption because you have absolutely no idea. So I think it might be an opportunity for us to take back that power and connect our repression, our suppression, and some of the things that we're going through in Kenya as queer folks as a form and a very big example of bad governance, and articulate that into seeing it in the vote. And I think it's just high time we have a queer bloc, to be very, very honest, not to centrally separate us from people, no, but to actually participate in engaging that perspective to the entire country at large, that this is a number of people who can actually very much turn tables in this particular positions too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that a lot of the conversations we're having with Queering the Ballot are connected, because that's a point that was also raised, that we are a voting bloc.
Yes.
And also, as we're looking to the coming elections, not just to look at the presidential seat, but to be interested in who our MCAs are,
down to the
who
MCA,
are members of parliament,
women reps,
all of them, to see it all together. And I think what you're saying also is going beyond that, but also articulating to the general public that the Kenya we want will take all of us.
Yeah.
And LGBT plus people are part of the Kenya that we want to see.
Yes.
So thank you so much for that. Ngare, I wanted to go back to the media and ask you, what role, given what Zaha has said about heading to the coming elections, what role do you think the media has to play in changing this, in making sure that like our needs are articulated also, and in forestalling some of the shortfalls we've seen, for example, in fair and balanced coverage? Do you, first of all, maybe I should ask, do you think the media has a role to play? And if so, what role do you think that is?
Yeah, I think the media has a role to play, both in terms of why the media exists, but also what constitutes even good journalism. I will use an example of something that we've been seeing lately, clips on social media based on interviews where Jeff Koinange is putting a politician on the spot, maybe about something they did, and some, I don't know if I can use the B word, but some bullshit that they said. And, Jeff Koinange just goes there and says, why you're taking us for fools? We know you did A, B, C, and D. And that is someone in power. I'm looking at that situation, and no one there, maybe the politician, but no one else, thinks of saying, hey, that's not fair. You need a balanced perspective. Jeff, we were like, no, yes, we need to go hard on this person because there's no other opportunity we have for this. Now, imagine a person comes, let's say there's a ruling recognizing the rights of queer people in the courts, and they've brought a religious leader to TV to be interviewed. And the religious leader says, no, we are against gay marriage, which the case wasn't even about. And you don't see the same level of pushback from the journalist. And I'm asking for something as simple as that. This is someone in power. This is someone in very, influential positions that even the president looks up to, the religious leaders. And you are not going to put them on the spot for their homophobia, or not even just homophobia, unsubstantiated claims, misinformation. And that also actually says something else, which is my second point, that when the media is not even sure what the facts are and what the truth is, they have nothing to fall back on or to base their pushback on. And so there's a place for the media to get informed, get educated about the issues, about even the cases that are being ruled upon. You'll see a lot of false reporting that is not pushed back on because even the journalists did not know they were reporting on something false. So it's not that they didn't want to push back. They just thought that was the truth or that was the fact. So there's a lot of that needs to happen. And finally, I think I started with the point of saying in journalism, we used to pride ourselves in saying we are here to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I've already talked about afflicting the comfortable in power, but comforting the afflicted, humanizing the person who is being dehumanized at this particular moment. I'm seeing no spaces for that. I'm seeing no opportunities being given for that. I'm not seeing a journalist just stopping and pausing and saying, wow, whatever else we think about your situation, what is happening to you is wrong. Something as simple as that. And I think that's a good place to begin before we can even now go into someone feeling safe enough to weigh in on the political discourse as a queer person in Kenya.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You're raising a really important and valid point around the responsibility that journalists and the media has, and that they need to own that responsibility because they're in a position where in these conversations they can push back. And it goes back to a point Zaha also raised around guidelines on reporting. So for you, Zaha, I want to focus on media engagement, right? Because going back to what you raised, that there are no guidelines on reporting, which is what guidelines on reporting should include how to humanize people, right? And which is why, it should also include, I would hope, how to cover stories, conducting research so that you are able to push back and say this is a case on association and freedom of association and not a case on gay marriage. So, Zaha, let me ask you, to your knowledge, what work do you know has been done to engage with the media from LGBT plus groups and organizations? What work do you think can be done? And how do you think we can engage with the media more effectively?
I've seen a couple of trainings from queer organizations for journalists, which is effective. But it has to, we have to be a bit strategic. Journalists don't work alone. By the time you go back to the newsroom, you have an editor, you have like a whole chunk of bureaucratics that you have to follow up before that story actually makes it to the newsroom or to the radio. I think media has a social responsibility because they have a social contract with the people who actually get to view them. So if you have a social contract, I deliberately have to see myself represented in these spaces. And so what does that look like? It looks like creating guidelines where these stories, and I like what Ngare has said, humanizing the dehumanized, which is actually very unfortunate that we have a group of people in the country that are dehumanized. It's actually very barbaric. And so to have a media house that is also not up to speed, like are you in 2010? It's 2026. Actually, not being able to articulate queer experiences and queer stories and any other sexual gender minority stories is actually a bit barbaric. It's actually very weird. You're not up to the times. It should be closed. So if you're open, reporting guidelines should definitely be a bit more expansive. They should focus on ensuring that even, for example, when we're reporting on matters gender-based violence and femicide, I see how the sensationalization happens whereby we focus so much on the victim and we re-traumatize communities, completely forgetting the perpetrator, completely shifting the shame from the perpetrator to the victim, which is insane. And that gets to also something Ngare said, the fact that we don't see some journalists also looking forward for the facts. Like you want to come and report a brief that you have absolutely no idea. So reporting guidelines should also have this quote unquote term around ensuring that the highest standards of factual investigation has been done before reporting, which will also open up a room to actually equally understand what are the real issues that are happening. So the fact that we're not seeing this articulation basically means that there's no homework being done, whereby we're not actually digging to find truthful factual evidence. We're seeing the same even when it comes to Supreme Court rulings for cases of femicide, and I'll speak for femicide because I work at the End Femicide movement, whereby a case is so clear in record, but when you listen to whatever is happening in the media houses, we'll talk about how the person was killed, how brutal it is, how sad it is. And of course, it's very critical, of course, that we speak to the experiences of the victims, but we completely dehumanize the situation. And we see that curriculum following up with the same people from queer folks and other sexual and gender minorities. So I think media has a responsibility. And I feel like we need to stop making it look like, especially traditional media, they make way too much money from Kenyans. They make way too much money from the audiences that they have. They have a responsibility towards that audience to protect and dignify the audience, but also to ensure that there's a safe space where these narratives are very well articulated to the people who get to see. Otherwise, if every Kenyan decides we're not watching traditional media, and we've seen a very big decline, over time, people are getting their news faster from TikTok and Facebook and Twitter rather than actual news. Credibility and how media can also get back the trust from the public would be such situations, creating guidelines that report things that actually matter and speak to people's lived experiences, including queer individuals. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I would like, before I ask you my final question, I'd like to offer the space to share any concluding remarks. We've discussed quite a bit. We've discussed owning the narratives. We've discussed our weaponization, how sexual and gender minorities are being weaponized, re-traumatized even in reporting. We've gone through how we can how there's opportunities on social media to take ownership of the narrative, despite the shifting landscape there, especially in terms of ownership, technological ownership, in terms of content moderation being completely scripted.
Yep.
So we've talked about quite a bit, and I'd like to give you the space to share some final remarks before I ask my final question. Thanks.
Wow. I think my final remarks will be based on something I like to call myself an alien citizen. That's something anyone who has encountered me has seen. And it is based on the world in which I exist, where I am surrounded by so many people, including myself, who on paper you have full citizenship. Like if you look on paper, you have an ID, you have everything. But then the world is treating you like an alien. And I have this desire, to see a world where everyone is treated as a full citizen. And being a full citizen comes with things, comes with not just responsibilities, but also privileges that you're supposed to enjoy as a citizen of a particular country, a particular society. And so for me, as far as when it comes to narratives about LGBTQ people, not just in the media, but also media as a proxy to political conversation, I want to see the citizenship of LGBTQ people amplified, honored, and respected. They're there to talk about the things that affect citizens, not just the things that affect queer folk. And they feel free to do it as themselves. When we bring a child, let's say, or an old person to a station to represent a particular demographic about a particular issue, no journalist spends time talking about how is it to be a child. They just ask for their opinion. They're like, yeah, that opinion is shaped by the fact that they're a particular demographic, but it is an opinion about the issue that the country cares about. Why can't we do that about queer people that are being interviewed? We recognize your identity, and it shapes how you see the world, and we care about your views about the world, not that identity. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Zaha?
Wow, there's so many things to say. I think, first of all, I hope uko kadi. I hope you have your voter's card. I feel like we need to move from talking to action. Your vote is as important as your freedom. You own that ID to go cast a vote, because the more you do not cast, the more we continue to remain in this slavery authoritarian regime. Own your narrative and explore your magic. I think it's very incredibly important for queer people to have the courage, the joy, and the love to create narratives for themselves and by themselves. I think another thing I like saying a lot: read, write, record, create. It's so important that we have more queer writers, that we have more queer speakers, that we have more queer professionals, that we have more queer businesses, that we have more queer enterprises, that we have more spaces that continue to value the queer experience. But also importantly, and as we continue to evolve and grow and build our space, you are human just as you are queer. And since you are human, you are a citizen of this republic. And since you're a citizen of this republic, you have the utmost responsibility, as written in the Constitution, that we, the people, have the power to do absolutely anything within our mandate to ensure that this country is ours, to live in, to exist in, and to thrive in. We do not pay taxes to survive. We pay taxes to thrive and live. That's from me.
Thank you so much. We've gone from wanting to see LGBT plus people's full, and sexual and gender minorities' full citizenship amplified, to a rallying call to read, write, record, and create. And I think this is really important, because if we're talking about the complexities of ownership when it comes to both mainstream and social media, then there is an urgency to create our own archives, to make sure our histories are well documented, so that we could, connecting back to Ngare's initial point on erasure, so we can make sure that we're not being erased. But also beyond that, taking full responsibility of our responsibilities as citizens, and registering to vote, which is what this podcast and Queering the Ballot as a campaign is trying to explore. So thank you so much. You actually, in your rallying calls, covered my last question. Good. But I'll still ask it in case there's a final offering around what kind of stories you want to see told about LGBT plus people and other sexual and gender minorities before, during, and after elections.
I think I've said it in a word, or in 2 words: stories of full citizenship.
I love that.
I think for me would be, I want to see more stories of joy action and innovation. It's high time we turn these tables like Jesus did in that temple in Jerusalem. Everybody should actually turn the tables, exist. And I think it's very important. And this is actually, if not the best time, to start creating more and writing more and reading more. And I think why I insist is because for as long as we have no accounted records of our existence, we will be fighting the same rhetoric a couple of years to come.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's it from us. Thank you so much for your insightful offerings, for sharing so generously of your work and of your, of your mind and intellect.
And you too. You did amazing. I loved this.
We appreciate you being here, and we appreciate you sharing with us so generously.
Thank you for having us.
Please don't forget to register to vote and show up and vote, as we've discussed. Also, please remember to follow Ainend, Galp Plus, and Ngare on the social platforms, and stay tuned for more episodes on Queering the Ballot.